I never believed monsters wore familiar faces until one sat at my kitchen table, complimented my lasagna, and asked my 8-year-old daughter about her day at school while planning his next assault on her innocence. This is the story of how that monster, my own brother-in-law, nearly destroyed us, and how my daughter's courage ultimately saved not just herself, but dozens of other children I would never meet. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and 3 years ago, I thought I understood what loss meant. I was wrong. Loss, I've learned, isn't just about death. It's about the shattering of trust, the violation of sacred bonds, and the terrible realization that evil can masquerade as love for months without detection. But this is also a story about survival, about the unbreakable bond between a mother and daughter, and about how speaking truth, no matter how painful, can literally save lives. If you think you know the limits of human resilience, if you believe that some betrayals are too devastating to overcome, prepare to be proven wrong. The beginning feels like it happened to someone else, though I know every moment was mine to live through. I was 34 when my husband David died in an industrial accident at the paper mill, where he'd worked for 12 years. The machine that crushed his chest in 17 seconds had been inspected just 3 weeks earlier and declared safe. That detail haunted me during the sleepless nights that followed, how quickly everything we'd built could be reduced to accident reports and insurance claims. Emma was 5 then, a bright-eyed little girl who believed her daddy could fix anything and would always come home for dinner. She had David's thick dark hair and my stubborn streak, along with an imagination that turned our modest backyard into kingdoms and adventure lands. The morning of the accident, she'd insisted on packing an extra peanut butter sandwich in David's lunchbox, because Daddy works so hard and gets hungry. He'd kissed her forehead and promised to save half for her when he came home. He never came home. The funeral was a blur of casseroles and condolences neighbors I barely knew filling our house with awkward sympathy and tuna salad. I remember the weight of Emma's small hand in mine as we stood beside the casket, her confusion about why Daddy wouldn't wake up no matter how many times she whispered his name. I remember the hollow sound of dirt hitting wood, and the way Emma's sobs echoed across the cemetery, like the cry of something wild and broken. But I remember clearly the moment David's older brother Jake pulled me aside afterward, his hand warm on my shoulder as Emma clung to my black dress. "Sarah, you don't have to carry this burden alone," he said, his voice thick with what I thought was shared grief. "David would want me to look after his girls. Let me help." At 38, Jake worked as a youth counselor at the county recreation center, beloved by kids and parents alike for his patience and dedication. He'd never married, always claiming he was too busy caring for troubled teens to settle down, though I suspected he simply hadn't found the right woman. Everyone in Millbrook knew Jake Mitchell as the man who gave second chances to kids. Others had written off the counselor who stayed late to drive teenagers home when their parents forgot to pick them up, who organized camping trips for kids who'd never seen mountains, who somehow reached through the anger and pain that turned good children into problems nobody else wanted to solve. That help became our salvation, or so I believed. Jake would arrive on Saturday mornings with groceries and offers to watch Emma while I ran errands, or simply sat in my car in empty parking lots crying until my chest ached from the effort of holding myself together. He fixed our leaky roof during a spring rainstorm, taught Emma to ride her bike in our driveway, while I watched from the kitchen window, and became the father figure she desperately needed after David's death left such a gaping hole in our lives. Those first months were survival pure and simple. I was working 2 part-time jobs, morning shifts at Sullivan's Bakery, where I learned to smile at customers while mixing cake batter through tears, and evening work cleaning offices downtown, pushing vacuum cleaners through empty cubicles while trying not to think about all the families going home to dinner together. The schedule was exhausting, but it allowed me to afford Emma's ballet lessons at Miss Susan's Dance Academy, where she twirled across wooden floors with dreams of becoming a professional dancer. "Uncle Jake makes the best pancakes in the whole world," Emma would announce on Sunday mornings, her face sticky with syrup and bright with what I thought was uncomplicated happiness. "Almost as good as Daddy used to make." Those words were balm to my grieving heart. David had been our family's breakfast chef, creating elaborate weekend meals that filled our kitchen with warmth and laughter. Watching Jake read bedtime stories to Emma in the same gentle voice David had used, seeing him patiently help her with homework at our kitchen table, where David's coffee mug still sat unwashed, made me believe that perhaps death hadn't robbed Emma of every positive male influence in her life. Jake's presence made my impossible schedule manageable. When I had to work double shifts or stay late to earn overtime pay, he was there to pick Emma up from school, help with homework, and ensure she ate something more nutritious than the cereal I'd been relying on during my worst days. He attended her dance recitals when I couldn't get time off work, cheering from the audience and recording videos on his phone that he'd show me later, Emma spinning across the stage in pink tulle with joy radiating from every movement. I was so grateful for his help that I ignored the subtle changes in Emma's behavior over the following months. She stopped running to the door when his truck pulled into our driveway, the excited Uncle Jake, replaced by continued focus on whatever she was doing. Her artwork, which had always covered our refrigerator in bright chaos, changed from cheerful family pictures to darker scenes with figures hidden behind trees or locked in houses with no windows. The nightmares started around her 7th birthday. She'd wake crying and unable to explain what had frightened her, reaching for me with desperate arms that clung like she was drowning. I'd hold her in our rocking chair, the same chair where I'd nursed her as a baby, where David used to sing her to sleep until her breathing steadied and she drifted back into restless sleep. Just growing pains. I told myself the same lie I repeated when she started wetting the bed again, when she began having stomach aches that sent her to the school nurse, when she started asking why Uncle Jake had to help with bath time and bedtime routines that I'd been handling alone since David's death. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the school counselor, had a reasonable explanation for everything. Emma's just processing her grief, she assured me during a parent conference, her office decorated with cheerful posters about feelings and friendship that seemed to mock the darkness Emma was carrying. Children often regress or become withdrawn as they work through trauma. Your brother-in-law's involvement is actually therapeutic, maintaining that family connection is crucial for her emotional development. I clung to those professional reassurances like a lifeline, desperate to believe that time would heal our wounds, and Emma's bright spirit would fully return. When she started having accidents at school, and the teacher mentioned that Emma seemed distracted and anxious, I attributed it to the approaching anniversary of David's death. When she stopped wanting to wear her favorite dresses and insisted on clothes that covered every inch of skin, I told myself she was going through a phase. The mind plays tricks on the grieving, I told myself, seeing problems where none exist. Single mothers are paranoid by nature, suspicious of help because they're used to carrying everything alone. Emma was processing trauma in her own way, and I needed to trust the professionals who understood child psychology better than a widow struggling to keep her head above water. Jake seemed to sense Emma's withdrawal and responded with even more attention, as if his concern could bridge whatever gap had opened between them. He brought her special gifts, art supplies that she used to create those darker pictures. Books about princesses who seemed sadder than the ones she used to love, candy that I pretended not to notice before dinner because I didn't have the energy to fight about everything. He volunteered to drive her to dance class when I couldn't leave work, and Miss Susan praised his dedication to Emma's progress. "That uncle of hers is a godsend," she told me one afternoon as I rushed in, still wearing my bakery apron, flour under my fingernails from a morning spent mixing bread dough. Emma lights up when he arrives to pick her up. "You're lucky to have such involved family." Lucky. The word would later taste like poison in my mouth, but then it felt like truth. In a world that had taken David from us too young, that left me scrambling to pay bills, and wondering if I was failing as a mother, Jake's presence seemed like compensation from a universe that owed us kindness. Our Sunday dinner tradition became sacred. During this period, Jake would arrive with ingredients for elaborate meals, teaching Emma to cook, while I caught up on housework or enjoyed rare moments of quiet. He'd show her how to measure flour for biscuits, let her crack eggs into mixing bowls, while he steadied her small hands, and praise her efforts with enthusiasm that made her beam with pride. These evenings felt like the family dinners of my childhood laughter echoing from the kitchen, the warm smell of roasting chicken filling our home with comfort that had been missing since David's death. Jake would tell stories about his work at the recreation center, describing troubled teenagers who'd turned their lives around with proper guidance and support. Emma would hang on every word, asking questions about the kids he helped and whether she could meet them someday. But even during these golden moments, there were signs I should have recognized. Emma's smiles seemed increasingly forced as the months passed, and she often excused herself early to retreat to her room. She'd develop sudden stomach aches during dinner preparation or remember urgent homework that required immediate attention. I rationalized her behavior as normal 8-year-old moodiness, not recognizing the careful way she watched Jake when she thought no one was looking, or how she always managed to sit as far from him as possible at our small dining table. The foundation of trust Jake built was so solid, so seemingly genuine in its concern for our well-being, that even when cracks began to appear, I smoothed them over with explanations that protected my need to believe in his goodness. Emma's increasing reluctance to be alone with him became independence in my mind. Her new habit of finding excuses to stay at friends' houses when he visited became healthy socialization. Her questions about why Uncle Jake needed to help her with baths and bedtime routines became curiosity about changing family dynamics. Looking back now, I realized that Jake's greatest skill wasn't his ability to manipulate Emma, but his talent for manipulating me. He understood that a grieving widow desperate for family support would overlook inconsistencies and red flags that might alarm someone less vulnerable. He knew that my gratitude for his help would blind me to the careful way he engineered private time with Emma, the suspicious timing of his visits, the gradual escalation of inappropriate boundaries disguised as care. But monsters, I've learned, eventually reveal themselves. The mask always slips, and when it does, the truth emerges with devastating clarity that changes everything forever. The revelation came on a Tuesday evening in October, during what should have been a routine night at home. I had returned early from my office cleaning job. The building's heat had failed, making work impossible in the freezing temperatures, and found our house dark except for the glow from Emma's bedroom. Jake's truck sat in our driveway, though I hadn't expected him until the weekend. "Emma, Jake," I called, dropping my purse by the front door where David's jacket still hung on its hook. "I'm home early." The silence that greeted me felt wrong, somehow heavy with tension I couldn't identify. Our house was small enough that voices carried easily from room to room, but I heard nothing except the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the kitchen clock David had installed years earlier. I climbed the stairs slowly, my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet David had always promised to replace, but never found time for in those last busy months. Emma's door was closed, which was unusual. She rarely closed her door unless she was changing clothes, and even then she usually called out to let me know what she was doing. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard Jake's voice through the wood, not the cheerful tone he used when others were around, but something lower, more urgent, with an edge that made every maternal instinct I possessed suddenly scream warnings I'd been ignoring for months. "This is our special game. Remember, good girls don't tell tales about special games. You want to be a good girl for Uncle Jake, don't you?" The words froze me in place. My hand extended toward the doorknob, but not quite touching it. There was something in his voice that triggered recognition. I didn't want to acknowledge a predatory quality that spoke to ancient fears every mother carries about threats to her children. Emma's voice came next, small and frightened in a way that made my heart stop beating for several seconds. "I don't like this game anymore, Uncle Jake. It hurts. I want Mommy. Mommy's at work, sweetheart. She won't be home for hours. Besides, if you tell Mommy about our games, it will make her very sad. She might get so upset that she gets sick like Daddy did. You don't want to make Mommy sick, do you?" The manipulation in those words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I threw open the door without knocking, and the scene that greeted me will be burned into my memory until the day I die. Jake was sitting on Emma's bed, his hands where they had no business being, while my daughter lay frozen with terror, tears streaming down her face, in steady tracks that spoke of suffering I'd failed to see or stop. For a moment that lasted eternity, nobody moved. Jake's face cycled through expressions, surprise, fear, calculation, before settling on the mask of concerned uncle. I knew so well the face that had eaten at my table, and praised my cooking, and listened to Emma's stories about school with apparent interest and affection. Sarah, you're home early, he said, his voice sliding back into the familiar tone of family concern. Emma was having another one of her nightmares, and I was just comforting her. She was so upset calling for you. Get out! The scream tore from my throat with such force that Jake actually flinched, his mask slipping for just an instant to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. Get your hands off my daughter and get out of this house. Jake's demeanor shifted as he realized his explanation wasn't working. The caring uncle facade cracking to reveal glimpses of the manipulator beneath. Sarah, you're misunderstanding what you're seeing here. Emma was upset about a bad dream, and I was helping her calm down. As her uncle, as someone who loves her. Get out before I call the police! I was shaking with rage so complete that I could barely form words, every cell in my body screaming for violence against this man who had violated the most sacred trust imaginable. He stood slowly straightening his clothes with deliberate calm that seemed designed to show he wasn't intimidated by my outburst. You're making a terrible mistake, Sarah. Emma will tell you the same thing when you've calmed down. I was helping her with a nightmare. Your grief is making you see things that aren't there, creating problems where none exist. But Emma's terrified whimpering from the bed told the real story. As soon as Jake left the room, she launched herself into my arms with desperate relief, sobbing with the kind of raw emotion that comes when safety finally arrives after long anticipation. Mommy, he hurt me, she whispered against my neck, her small body shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. He's been hurting me for a long time, but he said I couldn't tell because it would make you sick like Daddy got sick. He said if I told you might die too, and then I'd be all alone. The words shattered something fundamental in my understanding of the world, something I hadn't even realized was holding me together until it broke. This man I had trusted with my daughter's safety, welcomed into our home with gratitude and relief, relied upon for support during the darkest period of our lives, this man had been systematically abusing Emma while I worked to provide for us, while I grieved my husband and tried to rebuild our shattered lives. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating in its scope and calculation, that I couldn't process it all at once. Jake's voice carried up from the living room as he made phone calls, already working to discredit me before I could report what I'd discovered. Margaret, it's Jake. I'm worried about Sarah. She's having some kind of breakdown, making wild accusations. I think the anniversary of David's death is affecting her more than we realized. She's talking about calling the police, making claims that don't make any sense. He was already 3 steps ahead, crafting a narrative that would frame my horror as symptom rather than recognition, my maternal fury as evidence of instability rather than appropriate response to discovering my child's abuse. But holding Emma in my arms, feeling her desperate relief at finally being able to speak her secret aloud, I knew with absolute certainty that every word she whispered was real. Her terror was real. Her pain was real. And my failure to protect her from someone living under my own roof was a weight I would carry for the rest of my life. Baby, listen to me, I said, pulling back to look into her frightened eyes that looked so much like David's, but had seen things no child should ever witness. You are so brave for telling me. Uncle Jake lied to you, telling the truth about people who hurt you will never make Mommy sick. It makes Mommy proud of how strong and brave you are." Emma's sobs gradually subsided as I held her, replaced by the deep, shuddering breaths of someone who has finally set down a burden too heavy to carry alone. As her breathing steadied, I felt something volcanic building in my chest, a protective fury that every mother carries dormant until needed, now erupting with force that surprised me with its intensity. Jake had counted on my grief, my gratitude, my desperation for family support to blind me to his crimes. He had weaponized Emma's love for her dead father against her, using her fear of losing me to ensure her silence about abuse that had been escalating for months while I worked to keep us housed and fed and functioning. But he had made one crucial miscalculation. He had underestimated what a mother would do when she finally understood the truth. That night, as Emma's exhausted breathing finally evened into something approaching normal sleep, I made a promise that would define every day that followed. Jake would pay for what he'd done, and he would never hurt another child again. I didn't know how I would make that happen, didn't understand the legal and social obstacles that lay ahead, but I knew with the certainty of someone whose child has been violated that justice would be served, whatever the cost. The next morning brought my first harsh lesson about the gap between righteous anger and actual justice. Officer Martinez arrived within an hour of my call, a kind man with graying temples who took our statements with professional courtesy, but I could sense his skepticism beneath the surface politeness. Mrs. Mitchell," he said gently, his notebook balanced on our kitchen table where Jake had eaten Sunday dinners and praised Emma's artwork. "I need you to understand that allegations like this require very careful investigation. Your brother-in-law has an excellent reputation in this community. He works with children professionally, and several parents have already called the station expressing disbelief about these accusations." The system's immediate skepticism hit me like cold water thrown on fire. Martinez was thorough in his questioning, but his tone suggested he was checking boxes rather than building a case. Why hadn't Emma disclosed the abuse earlier? Why had I continued allowing Jake unsupervised access if I'd had any suspicions? How could I be certain that what I'd witnessed was actually abuse rather than innocent comfort being misinterpreted by a grieving mother? "With respect, Officer Martinez," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady and professional. "My daughter was terrified when I found them. She told me he's been hurting her for months. She described specific acts that no 8-year-old should know about unless she'd experienced them firsthand. Children sometimes develop precocious knowledge through various sources," Martinez replied, not unkindly, but with the weariness of someone who'd heard similar claims before. "Television older children at school overheard conversations between adults. We need medical evidence and corroborating testimony to support criminal charges in cases like this." The hospital examination was a special kind of hell that I wouldn't wish on any parent. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the pediatric specialist on call, was gentle with Emma, explaining each step of the process in child-friendly language, but nothing could make the experience less traumatic for either of us. I held Emma's hand while strangers documented evidence of trauma that confirmed my worst fears. Each clinical notation another nail in the coffin of innocence that should have been protected by the adults in her life. "The physical findings are consistent with the reported abuse," Dr. Chen explained quietly as we stood in the sterile hallway afterward, Emma finally sleeping in my arms after the exhausting examination. "However, I need to prepare you for the legal challenges ahead. Defense attorneys often argue that similar injuries could result from other causes, accidents, normal childhood activities, even behavioral issues related to trauma from losing her father." Detective Sarah Walsh, assigned to our case, was more encouraging, but equally realistic about the obstacles we faced. She was a 15-year veteran with prematurely gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too much of humanity's capacity for cruelty. But she spoke to Emma with infinite patience and treated our case with the seriousness it deserved. "Emma's disclosure is compelling," Walsh told me during our first formal interview conducted in a child-friendly room decorated with stuffed animals and bright colors that felt grotesquely cheerful given the circumstances. "But prosecuting child abuse cases requires building multiple layers of evidence. We need to establish pattern opportunity and motive while anticipating every angle the defense will use to discredit Emma's testimony. What kind of angles? I asked, though I suspected I didn't want to know the answer. Walsh's expression was grim. They'll argue that Emma's trauma from losing her father made her vulnerable to suggestion. They'll claim that your grief has influenced her perceptions, that she's seeking attention or trying to replace the father figure she lost. They'll bring in expert witnesses to testify about false memory syndrome, parental alienation, and the unreliability of children as witnesses in criminal proceedings. The character assassination began before we'd even filed formal charges. Jake's supporters rallied around him with the fervor of people defending their own judgment as much as his innocence. Parents whose children he'd counseled at the recreation center organized a petition supporting his character and questioning the wisdom of destroying a good man's career over unsubstantiated allegations from a traumatized family. His supervisor at the recreation center wrote a letter to the police chief praising Jake's dedication and professionalism, describing him as an invaluable member of our team who has helped countless troubled youth find direction and purpose. The letter went on to question whether ruining such a valuable community resource was worth pursuing charges based on the confused testimony of a grieving child and her unstable mother. My mother-in-law, Margaret, called within hours of learning about the investigation, her voice thick with disappointment and barely contained anger. "Sarah, honey, I understand that losing David has been incredibly difficult for all of us, but this accusation against Jake is tearing our family apart. He's been nothing but supportive since David died. Emma adores him, you've said so yourself dozens of times." "Margaret, I know what I saw," I replied, trying to keep desperation from my voice, while Emma colored nervously at the kitchen table, her artwork growing darker with each conversation that questioned her truth. "Children that age have such active imaginations." Margaret interrupted her tone, suggesting that I was the one being unreasonable. "And they're susceptible to adult suggestion, especially when the adult is upset or anxious. Have you considered that your own fears and suspicions might have influenced what you think you saw? That maybe Emma is picking up on your anxiety and creating stories to explain feelings she doesn't understand?" The conversation deteriorated from their ending with Margaret's thinly veiled threat to seek custody of Emma if I continued this destructive campaign against an innocent man who only tried to help our family during a difficult time. The message was clear. I could expect no support from David's family. In their minds, I was the problem, not Jake. Social services became involved within days of our initial report, adding another layer of bureaucracy and scrutiny to our lives. Caseworker Linda Hartwell arrived with a clipboard and an air of professional skepticism that made me feel like a suspect in my own home. I need to assess Emma's living situation and your fitness as a parent," Hartwell explained, settling into our kitchen chair with the comfort of someone accustomed to making such announcements. "Allegations of this nature often indicate broader family dysfunction that requires intervention and monitoring." Are you seriously suggesting that I'm the problem here?" I asked, watching Emma retreat to her room to avoid another adult asking probing questions about her private life. "My daughter was being abused by someone I trusted, and you're questioning my parenting." "I'm questioning the environment that allowed alleged abuse to continue undetected for what you claim was an extended period," Hartwell replied coolly, making notes on her clipboard. "My job is to ensure Emma's safety and well-being, which means examining all factors that contributed to this situation, including your supervision and decision-making. The interviews with Emma were particularly painful to witness." Hartwell asked probing questions about our home life, my work schedule, my relationships with men, my use of alcohol or medication to cope with David's death. She seemed determined to find evidence that I was an unfit mother whose negligence had created the conditions for abuse to occur. The isolation was suffocating. Friends from work began treating me differently, their conversations dying when I approached their smiles too bright and brief to be genuine. The morning shift at the bakery became an exercise in enduring whispered speculation and sideways glances from customers who recognized me from local gossip about the Mitchell family's situation. Sleep became impossible. I lay awake at night listening to Emma's breathing from the next room, replaying every interaction with Jake, searching for signs I should have recognized months earlier. The guilt was almost as crushing as the anger. How had I missed it? How had I failed to protect my daughter from someone living under my own roof? What kind of mother welcomes her child's abuser into their home with gratitude and relief? But if the system demanded more evidence than Emma's brave disclosure, I would find it. I approached the task with methodical determination, the same focus I'd used to arrange David's funeral and rebuild our lives from scratch. I researched Jake's background online and discovered that he'd worked at 3 different recreation centers over the past 15 years, always moving on after 2 or 3 years for what his LinkedIn profile described as new challenges and growth opportunities. The pattern seemed suspicious. Why would someone dedicated to youth counseling change positions so frequently? I started making phone calls pretending to be a potential employer, checking references. The first 2 centers gave glowing but brief recommendations, clearly following policies about limiting liability in reference checks. But the third call to a program in Grand Rapids, where Jake had worked 5 years earlier, yielded something more troubling. Jake Mitchell? The supervisor, a woman named Carol Stevens, paused long enough that I knew she was choosing her words carefully. He was competent in his work, very popular with the children, perhaps too popular if you understand my meaning. I'm not sure I do. I said, my pulse quickening as I sensed information that might help our case. There were never any formal complaints, Stevens continued carefully, but some concerns were raised by parents about boundary issues. Nothing we could substantiate, you understand, but enough to make his departure mutually beneficial for all parties involved. That conversation led me to research personnel records and incident reports that might have been filed but never pursued. I learned to navigate online databases, file Freedom of Information Act requests, and network with other parents who might have had similar concerns about Jake's behavior with their children. Detective Walsh became an unexpected ally in this process. While she couldn't officially encourage my independent investigation, she provided guidance about what kind of evidence would be useful and how to properly document what I found. You're doing good work, Sarah, she told me during one of our weekly check-ins. But I need you to understand that defense attorneys will scrutinize every piece of evidence you uncover. Make sure you document everything properly, date sources, exact quotes. Anything that looks like vigilante investigation or harassment could be used against us in court. The most significant breakthrough came through Emma's therapy sessions with Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the child psychologist Walsh had recommended. Dr. Hendricks used play therapy and art techniques to help Emma process her trauma, but she also uncovered details that strengthened our case considerably. Emma has disclosed additional incidents during our sessions, Dr. Hendricks explained during one of our private consultations. She's described a pattern of escalating behavior over approximately 18 months. The detail and consistency of her accounts are compelling evidence of genuine trauma, not fantasy or suggestion. Can you use those sessions in court? I asked, hoping we were finally building the kind of evidence the prosecutor needed. With proper preparation, yes. Emma's disclosures during therapy are admissible evidence, and I can testify about the behavioral indicators I've observed. Her drawings and play patterns clearly demonstrate post-traumatic stress consistent with sexual abuse, but Dr. Hendricks also prepared me for the challenges ahead. The defense will argue that therapy itself can create false memories through suggestive questioning. They'll claim that my sessions with Emma have contaminated her testimony and that her disclosures are the result of therapeutic influence rather than genuine memory. It's a standard tactic in these cases. One detail that emerged during therapy sessions would prove crucial to our case. Emma mentioned medicine that Uncle Jake gave her during their games, little white pills that made her sleepy and confused. When I pressed gently for more information, she described feeling fuzzy and unable to remember everything clearly after taking the pills. He said they were vitamins to help me grow strong, Emma told Dr. Hendricks during one session. But they made me feel funny, like when I had that operation on my ear and the doctor gave me sleepy medicine. Uncle Jake said not to tell you, because you might worry about me taking too much medicine." The revelation that Jake had been drugging Emma to ensure compliance added new dimensions to the charges against him and explained why her initial disclosures had been fragmented and sometimes contradictory. Detective Walsh took this information very seriously. "If Jake was giving Emma drugs without your knowledge, that adds several charges to our case: endangering a child, unlawful distribution of controlled substances, possibly drugging for sexual assault. We need to test Emma's hair for drug residue." The hair test results came back 3 weeks later, and they confirmed our worst fears. Emma's hair showed traces of diphenhydramine, a common antihistamine that causes drowsiness at levels consistent with regular administration over several months. The dosage was carefully calculated to cause sedation, without risking overdose, suggesting medical knowledge that fit with Jake's training in youth counseling and first aid. "This changes everything," Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh told me during our case review meeting. "We now have physical evidence that supports Emma's testimony and demonstrates premeditation on Jake's part. Drugging a child to facilitate abuse shows a level of calculation and planning that juries find particularly disturbing." But this discovery also meant revisiting Emma's memories with new techniques designed to help her recall incidents that had been obscured by medication. The process was delicate and traumatic, requiring specialized therapy that pushed Emma to remember experiences her mind had partially blocked for self-protection. "I remember being very sleepy sometimes when Uncle Jake was there," Emma told Dr. Hendricks during one of these sessions, her voice distant and confused. "Sometimes I would wake up and my clothes were different, or I was in Uncle Jake's car when I thought I was at home. He would tell me I'd had a bad dream or that I'd been sleepwalking because I missed Daddy so much." The gaslighting had been systematic and cruel. Jake had used Emma's drug-induced confusion to convince her that she was misremembering events, that her concerns about his behavior were symptoms of grief-related anxiety, that she needed his help to distinguish reality from nightmares brought on by losing her father. Armed with this new evidence, Detective Walsh was able to obtain a search warrant for Jake's home and vehicle. What they found there painted a picture of predation so calculated and extensive that it shocked even seasoned investigators who thought they'd seen everything. Jake's basement had been converted into what prosecutors would later describe as a grooming room, a space decorated with children's furniture, toys, and games, but equipped with locks on the inside, soundproofing materials, and hidden cameras positioned to record everything that happened there. The cameras had captured dozens of hours of interactions with multiple children, creating a library of abuse that dated back several years. "We've identified at least 12 other victims," Detective Walsh reported grimly during our next meeting, her face pale from reviewing evidence that would haunt her for the rest of her career. "Some as young as 6 others, as old as 14. Jake documented everything apparently for his own gratification and possibly to share with others online." The scope of Jake's crimes was breathtaking in its horror and organization. He hadn't just abused Emma, he'd been running what amounted to a child exploitation operation from his home, using his position at the recreation center to identify vulnerable children and his reputation in the community to gain access to their families. But the most shocking discovery came when investigators analyzed Jake's computer and found evidence of a larger network. Jake had been sharing videos and photographs with other predators across the country, participating in online forums where child abusers traded material and techniques for evading detection. "This isn't just about Jake anymore," Detective Walsh explained during an emergency meeting that included FBI agents. "He's part of an organized network of child predators. The FBI is now involved, and this case has implications far beyond Millbrook." The revelation that Emma had been victimized not just by Jake, but potentially exposed to a national network of predators sent me into a rage so complete that I couldn't function for several days. The thought that images of my daughter's abuse might be circulating among strangers across the country was a violation beyond anything I'd imagined possible. But it also meant that our case had federal support and resources that local prosecution couldn't provide. FBI agents with specialized training in child exploitation cases joined the investigation, bringing expertise in digital forensics and network analysis, that revealed the full scope of Jake's crimes. The pretrial detention hearing was no longer a question Jake was denied bail, based on the severity of the charges and the evidence that he'd been operating a continuing criminal enterprise involving child exploitation. As he was led away in handcuffs, his confident demeanor finally cracked, revealing the desperate fear of a predator who understood that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "You have no idea what you've started," he said to me as he passed our table, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "This is bigger than you understand, and there are people who won't appreciate your interference." The threat was unmistakable, and it required additional security measures for Emma and me during the remaining months before trial. But it also confirmed that we were on the right path, that exposing Jake's crimes had disrupted something larger and more sinister than anyone had initially realized. But Jake wasn't passive during the expanded investigation. His defense team, now led by formidable attorney Victoria Sterling from a prestigious Detroit firm, launched a comprehensive assault on our credibility that made their previous efforts look gentle by comparison. Sterling was a silver-haired woman with ice-blue eyes that seemed to catalog every weakness, every vulnerability that could be exploited. During her first press conference, she reframed the entire narrative with surgical precision. "My client is the victim of a comprehensive campaign of character assassination orchestrated by a grieving widow whose mental state has deteriorated significantly since her husband's tragic death," Sterling announced to a packed room of reporters. The allegations against Mr. Mitchell began with a single confused child whose trauma from losing her father was exploited by an increasingly unstable mother desperate for meaning in her loss. Sterling's team immediately filed motions to suppress the evidence seized from Jake's home, arguing that the search warrant was based on fabricated testimony from a coached child and the delusional theories of her mentally incompetent mother. They brought in expert witnesses to testify about false memory syndrome, parental alienation, and the suggestive nature of child therapy techniques. The hair test results showing drug residue were challenged on procedural grounds. Sterling argued that the chain of custody was compromised, that the testing facility had potential conflicts of interest, and that the medications could have been administered by me as part of an elaborate scheme to frame Jake. The assault on my character was relentless and personal. Sterling's investigators dug into every aspect of my life, interviewing former employers' neighbors, even people I'd dated briefly in high school 20 years earlier. They obtained my medical records from after David's death, highlighting prescriptions for anti-anxiety medication and sleeping pills as evidence of mental instability that called my judgment into question. The most devastating blow came when Margaret filed for emergency custody of Emma. The petition, clearly drafted with Sterling's input, painted me as an unstable single mother whose obsession with destroying Jake had created an unsafe environment for a vulnerable child. The custody hearing was scheduled for just 2 weeks before Jake's criminal trial was set to begin. Sterling's attempt to remove Emma from my care before she could testify while simultaneously undermining my credibility as a witness and parent. The pressure became crushing. I was fighting battles on multiple fronts: criminal court, family court, social services, and the court of public opinion, each requiring different strategies and resources I didn't possess. My savings were depleted, my credit cards maxed out, and I was working only part-time because of the demands of legal proceedings. Emma's nightmares returned with intensity we hadn't seen since the early days after her disclosure. She was having trouble concentrating at school, and her teacher reported behavioral changes that concerned the administration. The irony was heartbreaking. Seeking justice for Emma's abuse was creating new trauma that threatened her recovery and our family's stability. "I wish I never told," Emma sobbed one night after waking from a particularly vivid nightmare where Jake was chasing her through our house while adults stood by watching and refusing to help. "Uncle Jake was right that it would make everything bad. Maybe if I say I made it up, everyone will be nice to us again." Hearing my daughter consider recanting her truthful testimony to escape the pressure we were facing was the lowest point of the entire ordeal. The system designed to protect children was instead teaching her that speaking up led to punishment, that truth-telling was dangerous, that silence was safer than seeking justice. But in that moment of despair, I found a strength I didn't know I possessed. Looking at Emma's tear-stained face, I realized that our fight was bigger than personal justice. It was about the message we sent to every child who might face similar choices in the future. Baby, listen to me, I said, holding her close in the rocking chair where I'd comforted her as a baby. Uncle Jake lied to you about what would happen if you told the truth. Yes, some people are being mean to us now, but that's because they're scared of what you said, not because you did anything wrong. Good people like Dr. Hendricks and Detective Walsh, they believe you, and they're working to make sure Uncle Jake can never hurt another little girl. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in February, the courthouse steps slick with ice that seemed to mirror the treacherous legal terrain we were about to navigate. After months of preparation motions and pretrial battles, the moment of reckoning had finally arrived. Jake entered the courtroom flanked by his defense team, his appearance transformed by expensive tailoring and careful styling designed to project innocence and respectability. His supporters filled the gallery behind him, colleagues from the recreation center, parents whose children he'd counseled, church members who believed in his righteousness. They outnumbered our handful of supporters 3-1, their presence a constant reminder of how isolated we'd become in seeking justice. Emma's testimony came on the third day of trial. She walked to the witness stand in her best blue dress, the one that made her look even younger than her age, clutching the stuffed elephant Dr. Hendricks had given her for courage. Her voice was small but clear as she was sworn in, promising to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Prosecutor Walsh guided Emma through her testimony with infinite patience, allowing her to tell her story in her own words while providing enough structure to address all the legal elements. Emma described Jake's escalating behavior, the special games that made her uncomfortable, the pills that made her sleepy, and his threats about what would happen if she told anyone about their secrets. He said if I told about our games, it would make Mommy sick, like Daddy got sick. Emma testified, her green eyes focused on Walsh's encouraging face. He said good girls keep family secrets, and that if I was a tattletale, no one would love me anymore. Sterling's cross-examination was a masterclass in creating doubt without appearing to attack a child. She questioned Emma gently about her memory of events, the timing of her disclosure, and whether anyone had helped her remember things differently than she first told them. Emma, you've talked to a lot of grown-ups about Uncle Jake, haven't you? Sterling asked with false kindness. Sometimes they asked you to remember more details, didn't they? And when you told them more, did they seem happy about that? The questioning was insidious, designed to make Emma doubt her own memories without Sterling appearing cruel to a child witness. But Emma's moment of defiance, "I'm telling the truth and I don't care if people don't believe me," was perhaps the most powerful testimony of the entire trial. When Jake finally took the stand, his initial testimony was smooth and convincing. He portrayed himself as a grieving brother, trying to help his deceased sibling's family, explaining away each piece of evidence with practiced sincerity and apparent emotion. But Prosecutor Walsh's cross-examination exposed the cracks in his facade. As she pressed him about inconsistencies in his timeline and the evidence found in his home, Jake's composure began to crumble. "What did Emma misunderstand, Mr. Mitchell?" Walsh asked after Jake suggested the child had misinterpreted his intentions. "What intentions of yours could an 8-year-old possibly misinterpret as sexual abuse?" Jake realized he'd walked into a trap, essentially admitting that something inappropriate had occurred. His careful mask finally slipped completely as Walsh continued her relentless questioning. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising. Emma needed someone who understood her pain, someone who could give her the attention she wasn't getting at home. By giving her drugs and sexually abusing her, Jake's face went pale as he realized how completely he'd revealed his predatory mindset. The jury had heard him essentially confess, and there was no going back. The guilty verdict came after just 4 hours of deliberation. As Jake was led away in handcuffs, sentenced to 25 years to life, Emma squeezed my hand and whispered, "Mommy, I'm proud that I told the truth. Now Uncle Jake can't hurt any more little girls. The aftermath brought both relief and new challenges. We relocated to Grand Rapids, where I found work with a victim advocacy organization. Emma thrived in her new school, and slowly we began building a life focused on healing rather than survival. My work at the advocacy organization allowed me to channel my experience into helping other families. I developed the Emma Protocol guidelines for trauma-informed interviews with child victims that improved conviction rates while reducing secondary trauma. About 6 months into my new position, I met Michael Stevens, a social worker who volunteered with our organization on weekends. He was soft-spoken and thoughtful, with prematurely gray hair and kind eyes that seemed to understand the weight of our work. Michael had extensive experience with child trauma cases and often offered insights that helped me refine our training programs. "Your approach to victim interviews is revolutionary," he told me one afternoon as we organized materials for an upcoming conference. "The way you've translated Emma's experience into practical guidance for professionals, it's exactly what the field needs." His understanding of trauma dynamics was impressive, and he showed particular interest in our family's case. He asked thoughtful questions about Emma's recovery and offered suggestions for resources that might help other survivors. When he occasionally suggested we grab coffee to discuss program development, his manner was professional and respectful. I found myself looking forward to these conversations, though I maintained careful boundaries. The idea of dating felt premature. I was still processing my own trauma and focusing entirely on Emma's needs. But Michael's insights were valuable, and his gentle encouragement helped me recognize the broader impact our advocacy work was having. Emma was initially wary of Michael when he occasionally stopped by our office during her after-school visits, but his interactions with her were appropriately distant and respectful. His understanding of boundaries impressed me, especially given my heightened vigilance about any adult's interest in my daughter. The years passed with steady progress. Emma grew stronger and more confident, channeling her experience into a desire to help other children. Our advocacy work expanded statewide, training hundreds of professionals in trauma-informed approaches. The federal investigation into Jake's network resulted in 23 convictions across 8 states, with evidence showing that hundreds of children had been protected because of Emma's courage. 3 years after Jake's conviction, I felt we'd built a stable, meaningful life from the wreckage of our trauma. Emma was 11 and thriving, playing soccer and taking piano lessons while maintaining the kind of normal friendships that had nothing to do with our advocacy work. Then the letter arrived, not from Jake, but about him, written by federal prosecutor Rebecca Phillips in Arizona. As I read her words, my understanding of what we'd survived shifted once again. The letter revealed that Jake's abuse of Emma had been part of a calculated targeting operation by an organized network that had identified our family shortly after David's death. We'd been under surveillance for months, our vulnerabilities cataloged and exploited with military precision. But the final paragraph made my blood run cold. Mitchell provided evidence that the network was planning to target Emma again through a different operative who had been positioned as a potential romantic interest for you. This individual, who went by the name Michael Stevens, had been developing a relationship with you through your workplace. We've arrested Stevens and charged him with conspiracy to commit child abuse and exploitation. Michael Stevens, the thoughtful social worker who'd shown such understanding of trauma recovery, who'd praised our advocacy work, who'd asked me to coffee with such professional respect. He'd been another predator positioned to exploit the trust that comes with surviving abuse. The revelation that we'd been targeted again, that the network had tried to use my own advocacy work to regain access to Emma, filled me with horror, but also confirmation that our fight had been worth every sacrifice. We hadn't just survived, we'd disrupted something truly evil. That evening, I explained to Emma what I'd learned. Instead of being frightened, she was proud that our actions had protected other children and prevented additional crimes. "Good," she said simply. "I'm glad we stopped them. And I'm glad that man didn't get to hurt me again." As I finish writing this, Emma is preparing for her 12th birthday. She's decided she wants to become either a prosecutor or a therapist. She hasn't chosen which path will let her help more children who need someone to believe them. Her bedroom wall still displays a map marking locations where network members were arrested, each star representing a child who's safe because she found the courage to speak. Looking back on everything we endured, I'm struck by how many moments could have gone differently. But Emma's voice changed everything, and it continues to echo in every child who finds courage to speak, every parent who chooses to believe, and every professional who commits to truly listening when innocence cries out for protection. The monsters are real, but so is our power to stop them. All it takes is one brave voice willing to break the silence, and one person willing to believe that voice deserves to be heard. Emma showed us the way. Now it's up to the rest of us to follow.